Great. I've started the recording, just so you know. Welcome everyone to September 21st, the Forest Connect webinar series. My name's Peter Smallage. I'm the host. I coordinate the Forest Connect program, and one of our program activities is a monthly webinar series, and we've had a variety of very interesting topics over the years. Today is no different. We've never had, I don't think we've ever had one on bats. We've had a large number of wildlife presentations, but we are joined today for the topic. I'll give you the topic first. There are several authors and one primary presenter, but bats, understory treatment and green tree retention, using these to manage for biodiversity and with forest management as a tool. So the primary presenter is Julia Rizzo. She's a second-year master's student at the SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry. At SUNY-ESF, she's doing research on Myotis, and I probably mispronounced that, Myotis bats and forest management in the Adirondack Park. She has a bachelor's in biology and environmental science from Clarkson University in 2020, and she's based at the ESF Newcomb campus. Her advisor and co-author on this presentation is Dr. Vanessa Royhaus, who's an assistant professor at SUNY, also SUNY-ESF, where she's been teaching wildlife and GIS courses at the Ranger School, so up in Wanakena since 2018. She has a PhD in biology from Indiana State University, where she focused on bat ecology in the Appalachian Mountains of Tennessee. She's been studying bats for 15 years, which includes surveying the federally protected Indiana and northern long-eared bats in national parks and forests. Two other co-authors, Stacy McNulty. Some of you'll remember Stacy, who co-presented with Dr. Nyland just a few months ago about beech, is an ecologist and the associate director of research at the SUNY-ESF Adirondack Ecological Center in Newcomb. She has research interests that include northeastern temperate ecosystems and the forest ecology and landscape ecology of those through social ecological systems. She's focused on broadening student and public participation in field studies, and previously served as the president of the Organization of Biological Field Stations. And also Greg McGee, who's an associate professor and undergraduate director at SUNY-ESF, has research interests in the effects of forest management practices on land use history on forest biodiversity and ecosystem processes. So I'd like to welcome these, all four of them. I don't know if Greg is on. If he is, we'll give him a shout out. Julia, Vanessa, and Stacy are present, and Julia is presenting. So Julia, thank you very much. I know you and Vanessa have put a lot of work into this. I look forward to learning about this, and I'm just going to mute myself, and it's all yours. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Julia, I'll just jump in real quick right before you get started. I just wanted to add a little bit more. We'll save questions until the end. So this is Vanessa here. We'll save questions till the end, but go ahead and throw them in the chat. But that way everyone's not getting too distracted by responses in the chat as well. And yeah, I just want to say, you know, we all, Stacy, Greg, and I are co-advising Julia on her master's research. She's going to present some data from the first year as she just finished up her second field season of research. So we're going to give you a little taste of what's to come and let you know about some of the cool stuff that is happening over here. You'll notice we're all from different ESF campuses. So if you have questions about that, you can throw that into the chat as well. But it's really fun working collaboratively across our campuses. And I will let Julia share what she's been up to. Thank you everyone for attending.
Yeah, thank you everyone for being here. Like they said, I'm Julia, and I'm going to be presenting on bats, understory treatment, and green tree retention, biodiversity, and forest management. So here's the outline of what I'm going to be going through today. I'm going to do a general introduction to bat biology, and then move into how bats use managed forests, and then move into my study looking at how bats are using an experimental beach management site in the Adirondack Park. So going into a little bit of an introduction to bat biology, bats are mammals in the order Chiroptera. They are not rodents. There's sometimes some misconceptions. People think that bats are just flying mice. That's definitely not the case. They are in their own order. There is a high diversity of bat species. As you can see from this pie chart here, Chiroptera has the second largest number of species behind Rodentia, which are the rodent species. Bats in the US are primarily insectivores that hunt using echolocation, but there are a few nectar-feeding species in the Southwest US. There are many myths about bats. People may have had bad experiences with them in their houses, things like that, but they do have a positive impact on the ecosystem and provide important ecosystem services. So, for example, it's estimated that bats account for around $22.9 billion a year in pest control for agriculture alone. So my research has been based in New York, so we're going to focus on the bats in New York State. There are 9 species found here, and I'm going to group them into 2 categories, the 3 migratory species and the 6 hibernating species. So these are our 3 migratory bat species. There is the hoary bat, the silver-haired bat, and the eastern red bat. The migratory bats tend to have larger body sizes than the hibernating bats. The hoary bats are the largest bats in New York and have a wingspan of around 13 to 16 inches. The migratory bats generally have lower frequency echolocation calls. We'll talk about that a little bit more later in the presentation. And they will roost in the canopy of trees, in the leaves, or in the pine needles. They tend to forage in larger open areas and above the tree canopy. And these bat species do migrate to the southern US for the winter. We don't know exactly where they're going. So for example, we don't know exactly where the bats from the Adirondack Park are migrating down south, but that's a topic of new ongoing research. So hopefully we'll have some studies looking at that soon. So these going into the hibernating bat species, these are our 2 non-Myotis species in New York. There is the big brown bat and the tricolored bat. The tricolored bat is now up for listing as a federally endangered species. These are our 4 Myotis bats, or mouse-eared bat species, that are in New York. Starting with the little brown bat in the top left corner, that is our most common bat in New York State. The Indiana bat has been listed as a federally endangered species since the 1960s due to habitat degradation, and unfortunately, the populations are continuing to go down. The northern long-eared bat is also a federally threatened species and is up for listing as federally endangered. The eastern small-footed bat is a little bit different from the other 3 species, as it has different roosting and different roosting preferences. It will stay in rock crevices year-round. It doesn't use trees like the other 3 species. So throughout the presentation, when I talk about Myodis, I am just going to be talking about the northern long-eared, little brown, and Indiana bat. And while I have these pictures on the screen, you can see how similarly all of these species look. They also sound very similar, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But when you have the bat in hand, you can identify them by things like face color, and if they have toe hairs or not, and a couple other things, but they all look very, very similar. So these hibernating bat species have smaller body sizes. You can see that Myotis bat, compared to the size of that person's hand, it's very small. Just as a comparison, little brown bats have a wingspan of around 8 to 10 inches. Myotis species have higher frequency calls than the migratory bats, which allows them to forage in more cluttered environments. The big brown bats do have lower frequency calls, more consistent with the migratory species. And like I said before, all of these bats, besides the small-footed bat, will migrate from their summer roosts in trees to caves to hibernate over the winter. So although I didn't classify these as migratory bats, they do kind of a local migration. So they'll migrate from their forests that they use for the summer habitat to local caves to hibernate. So why study bats? As mentioned before, bats are important for pest control for agriculture, but also in forests for the prevention of defoliation. Bats are also prey species for things like predatory birds, primarily owls, and other predators like raccoons. So they're also important to the ecosystem in that way. And most importantly, there have been major population declines in the hibernating bat species due to white nose syndrome. I'm going to go a little bit into white nose syndrome in the next slide. So white nose syndrome has led to the potential listing of 2 bat species, the tricolored bat and the northern long-eared bat, and has further reduced the population of the already endangered Indiana bat. And federal protection means potential forestry regulations because forests serve as the summer habitat for bats. So learning more about bats and their habitat requirements is critical to conserving bat species and hopefully raising their populations. So going into what white nose syndrome is, this disease was first discovered in a cave near Albany in a popular tourist cave. I don't know if you've ever been to Howe Caverns, but that's where it was first discovered in 2007. It's caused by a European fungus species. The bats in Europe are naturalized to the fungus, so it doesn't have the effect there that it does here. And they think it spread to the US through contaminated caving equipment. So this fungus causes bats to wake up during hibernation, which uses up their energy stores. The fungus grows on their nose and on their wings. So you can see in the picture there, the white noses, that's the fungus. So this fungus causes the bat to wake up during hibernation, and sometimes they actually try to find insects in the winter, and there's no insects present in the winter, so the bats end up dying of starvation and dehydration. The Myotis species are the most impacted by white nose, with some populations being reduced up to 90%. And due to white nose syndrome, like I said before, the northern long-eared bat and the tricolored bat are now up for consideration as federally endangered species. So just showing how much white nose syndrome is spread, this is the map of where white nose was in 2008 once they started doing surveillance on caves. And this is where white nose syndrome was this past winter. So white nose used to be thought of as just an East Coast problem, but as you can see, it's now spread throughout the country and into Canada. So there are several ways to monitor bat populations depending on the season. In the winter, there are hibernacular counts. In the summer, there is mist netting and radio telemetry, emergence counts, and acoustic sampling. And in the fall, bats can be surveyed when they're swarming and breeding around caves. So winter hibernacular counts are when bats are identified and counted in caves as they're hibernating in the winter. This can be somewhat difficult due to how tightly packed the bats are. As you can see in this picture, the bats all cuddle up really close next to each other, and there can be a mix of species in those groups of bats. So it can be difficult to do this. But these are primarily done by state or federal agencies due to strict white nose syndrome guidelines. The cave locations where the bats hibernate are often protected from public knowledge, and the entrances are gated to prevent people from going in there and disturbing the bats as they're hibernating. So another way to monitor bats is through mist netting and radio telemetry. This is used to determine more confident knowledge of species presence and also determine the roost locations. To do mist netting, it does require permits, university approval, and rabies vaccinations. So it is regulated. You can't just go out and catch bats. To do mist netting, you use large nylon nets up to 12 meters across, and you place them across roads or streams. So then when the bats are foraging, they fly into the net and they get tangled up in the net. So as you can see on the picture on the left here, that's our technician Alexa looking at a little brown bat that's tangled up in a net. So once you take the bat gently out of the net, you can ID the species, you weigh it, measure it, and you attach a forearm band. And sometimes you can attach a radio transmitter, and that's shown in this middle picture here. So the radio transmitters for Myotis bats have to be very tiny since Myotis are so small, they're about the size of your fingernail. When you're doing mist netting, you have to wear PPE and use strict decontamination procedures to prevent the spread of white nose syndrome between the bats. And now because of COVID, you have to wear N95 masks so we don't accidentally spread COVID to the bats. So once you release the bat with the transmitter on it, it will fly to its daytime roost. And you can use radio telemetry, which I'm doing in that picture there, to try to find the roost trees. So once the roost is found, you can do an emergence count to see how many bats are living in a specific roost. And the emergence counts are done at sunset, so you can see the bats flying out to do their nightly foraging. And also, as I mentioned before, monitoring is sometimes done during fall breeding and swarming, and that involves mist-netting bats near cave entrances to see which species are using caves. So another way to monitor bats is through acoustic sampling. Acoustic sampling is a more non-invasive way to monitor bats, and it can be passive or active. So when a detector is attached to the top of a vehicle, as shown in the bottom photo here. Mobile acoustic transects are done to monitor bats foraging on roads, and the New York State DEC does this throughout the state to monitor bat activity. Another method of active sampling is more for recreational use. So there are microphones that can be attached to your phone or tablets that will show the echolocation calls of bats flying by in real time. And all of these methods record the bat's ultrasonic echolocation calls, shown in this picture here, that can be used to identify species. So here's some more echolocation calls. Calls are identified manually or by using automated programs. These calls here were identified using Kaleidoscope Pro. The automated programs are unfortunately not 100% accurate, and many researchers use a combination of auto ID and manual vetting. You can tell the species by looking at the frequency range and the shape of the call. So you can look at the differences between these two calls. This top one here is a hoary bat, and the bottom one here is a little brown bat. So you can see the hoary bat call has a much lower frequency than the little brown bat call, and also the shape is different. For reference, people hear at around 20 kilohertz. So you might be able to hear clicks from the hoary bat call, but you wouldn't be able to hear this little brown bat call at all without slowing down the recording. And just a note, Myotis species are difficult to tell apart by looking at them, but they're also difficult to tell apart by their calls. So many studies will lump together all the Myotis species into one Myotis category. And also one last cool thing, you can see at the end of both of these calls, the pulses get close together. That's called a feeding buzz. So that's when the bats actually caught an insect. So now I'm going to move into how bats use managed forests. So first, how do bats use forests? So forests serve as the summer habitat for all the bat species in New York, and they use forests for foraging and for roosting. So foraging location depends on the morphology and the call frequency of a particular species. Myotis bats are smaller and have higher frequency calls, so they're able to forage in more cluttered environments. Migrating bats are larger and have lower frequency calls, so they'll tend to forage in large open areas and above the tree canopy. So Myotis bats can forage in those cluttered areas, but it was actually found that they will choose the forest openings if they're available. And that study was done in the same study region that I'm working in. It also has been found that bats will forage in forest openings created by forest management preferentially. Particularly, this study found that bat species in Ohio will use shelter wood cuts for foraging. So going into roosting, I just want to make clear, I'm just talking about the natural roost, not any of the man-made roosts, things like that. I'm just going to be talking about roosting in trees. So like I previously mentioned, migrating bats will roost in the tree foliage of live trees, whether that be pine needles or leaves in the tree canopy. Most Myotis and big brown bats will roost in the bark or cavities of trees. So they'll do what this little bat is doing and kind of shove themselves in between the peeling bark. Bats will use trees as their daytime roost to sleep, and some trees will serve as maternity roosts with many bats and their pups occupying the same tree. Adequate maternity roosts are critical to bat life history, since Myotis bats and a lot of other bat species only have one pup a year, so they need an adequate place to raise them. Bats also have been found to roost in managed forests. So which trees are the bats using in New York? Well, there has been very little research on roost trees in New York, and there has been no published studies in the Adirondack Park. We do have some Indiana bat roost data from this study done in 2006 in the Champlain Valley. They found that roost trees were on average 45 centimeters in diameter and 18.9 meters tall, and 88% of the bats roosted under bark. The bats in this study most frequently roosted in live shagbark hickory trees, followed by American elm snags. So those trees are rarely found in the Adirondacks. These are the trees that are most common in the Adirondacks, and in this study, the bats roosted in those trees less frequently and mostly in snags. So it definitely would be interesting to see a study just in the Adirondacks where the bats are roosting when only those trees are present. So because roost trees are so important to bat life history, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has recommended guidelines in place for forest management within the range of the federally protected Indiana and northern long-eared bats to preserve those roost trees. I'm going to briefly summarize these guidelines, and we can provide a link so you could read the full thing. So each state does provide its own guidelines just because the differences in tree species. So the first recommendation is that 60% canopy cover be maintained. The next guideline is that shagbark hickory, which was seen in the last slide as the most used tree species by those bats, and also shellbark hickory, should not be harvested because the bats were using those the most to roost. And also standing snags, as long as they're not hazardous, should be retained. This also goes into tree species in particular. It says to maintain at least 3 live trees of any of these desired species per acre that are greater than 20 inches DBH. It says should leave a stream buffer, and also no cutting of trees greater than 5 inches DBH from April to September when the bats may be present in the trees. So these guidelines provide an example of how bat habitat can be maintained, but it's very important to look at the research done in your local area to determine the trees that should be retained. The trees that bats use to roost vary a lot depending on which trees are present in the landscape. So now getting into more of the specifics of my study, looking at Myotis bats and forest management in the Adirondack Park. So if you're not familiar, the Adirondack Park is a New York State park. It is 6.1 million acres. It's unique in that it's a conglomerate of public and private land, and that private land has a long history of forest management that continues into the present. So getting more specific, my study site within the Adirondacks is in the SUNY-ESF Huntington Wildlife Forest. This is located in the center of the Adirondack Park in Newcomb, New York. It is 15,000 acres. There has been biological monitoring and forest management ongoing there since 1932. The forest is dominated by northern hardwoods and also mixed conifer and conifer species. The most common species is American beech, followed by sugar maple, red maple, and yellow birch, and the conifer species. So within Huntington Forest, this is my study site. So this blue outline here shows the outline for Huntington Forest, and then this orange outline here is my study site. So within Huntington Forest, my study site is a 250-acre area known as Electric Fence. That name is a remnant of when they did deer exposure studies back in the 60s. So at this site, they did an experimental beech management cut in 7 sections and left 7 sections as control. So these sections with the T in front of them were the treated sections that they cut, and the sections with the U are the untreated sections that they left as a control. So why did they do this treatment? So as I mentioned, forests in Huntington and in Adirondacks are beech dominated, and beech are infected with beech bark disease. So beech bark disease is caused by the association of an invasive scale insect and fungi species, and it kills beech at all size classes. American beech naturally reproduce by using clonal root sprouts, but the stress from beech bark disease causes them to produce more vegetative root sprouts than they would usually. These sprouts outcompete other tree species that may be more desirable to wildlife and foresters. And this is just an example of what beech bark disease looks like. So the management goal in electric fence was to reduce beech sprout clutter while maintaining wildlife habitat. And this ended up creating what can be classified as an irregular shelter wood. So going into a little bit what an irregular versus a traditional shelter wood is, a traditional shelter wood creates an even age stand where the overstory trees are of one age class and understory trees are of another. And it kind of looks like this. That's just an example. And an irregular shelter wood, like what they created in electric fence, creates forest structure with multiple age classes and a range of spatial distribution of the residual stems. So this is the specific prescription used at the electric fence site. They cut all the beech greater than 5 feet tall. They retained all conifers and non-beech hardwood saplings, pole size, and small saw timber. They cut all non-beech trees less than 18 inches DBH of unacceptable growing stock. They cut all non-beech hardwoods greater than 18 inches DBH to a 70-foot distance, and they retained specific wildlife trees and snags. So these are some visuals that I took last fall showing the control section versus a cut section. As you can see in the control section, there's a lot of that beech clutter, a lot of vertical structural complexity in there. And in the cut section, all of that has been removed, but these larger trees are still on the landscape. So as I mentioned in the prescription, specific wildlife trees were retained. So these were trees that were specifically picked out for having features like cavities that wildlife could use. And many of these trees ended up being snags. I'll talk about this a little bit more in the methods, but the habitat on these retained trees was classified using a framework developed in forests in Europe. This framework creates categories of features of trees or tree-related microhabitats, or TREMs for short. This can include things like cavities, peeling bark, broken crown, things like that. And this just allows us to quantify the habitat on each one of those retained trees. So these are my two main study questions that I'm going to be focusing on for this presentation. So how are Myodis bats using managed versus unmanaged sections of forests, and what factors are driving differences in the habitat use? I do have a third question. Are TREMs important in determining bat habitat use? I'm not going to be focusing on that one for this presentation, and I'll talk a little bit more about it in the end. So getting into my methods, I used passive acoustic sampling for this study. I rotated ultrasonic detectors through 14 sections of electric fence at least twice from July to September 2021. These are all the points where I put my detectors. The points are in blue of where I put my detectors in electric fence. The detectors were left at each site for 7 days for a total of 196 detection nights total in the summer of 2021. I do have more acoustic data from the summer of 2022, but I just pulled my detectors out of the field last week. So I'm analyzing that data, and eventually that data will be incorporated into the study. So to measure the vegetation at each detector point, I did 5 fixed radius plots. I did one at the center point where the detector was, and then one in each cardinal, one in 25 meters in each cardinal direction. In these plots, I recorded the number and the size class of saplings that were less than 10 centimeters DBH, and the canopy cover in the center of the plot. I also recorded the DBH of all trees over 10 centimeters, as well as all the tree-related microhabitats on those trees. So to give an example of how we did this, I included part of our data sheet here. So we recorded the species, DBH, and then we looked at all these TREMs here, and we basically checked off what each tree had. So for example, on this snag here, I see 2 cavities, so we would put 2 cavities in there. And it also has peeling barks, we would put yes. For this part of the study, I use a total of 70 vegetation plots. So now getting into my data analysis methods, I use occupancy modeling as my primary method of data analysis. Occupancy modeling has 2 parts, probability of detection and probability of occupancy. Probability of detection is the chance an animal is detected given continuous or changing variables, so things like weather. So for example, the bats won't be flying as much if it's raining, so there's going to be less of a chance of detecting them. Probability of occupancy is the chance an animal is detected given discrete or unchanging variables, so the site data or the vegetation data. So for example, bats may forage more in areas with less canopy cover, so there would be a higher probability of occupancy at those areas. Using detection and occupancy variables ensures that we account for imperfect detection. So just because a bat isn't there on one night doesn't mean that it doesn't occupy the space. And it's important to note that occupancy modeling doesn't model animal abundance. So as shown here, we used a binary 1 or 0 for present or absent of the bats. For these models, I only use Myotis species just because they're the most common and also the most imperiled. To do this data analysis, I used a couple different programs. So I used Kaleidoscope Pro through Wildlife Acoustics to get all of the species ID and get the presence and absence data. I use R and RStudio to do t-tests and correlation tests. And I use the program Presence to actually do the occupancy modeling. So these are the detection and occupancy variables I put into my models. For the detection variables, they're mostly weather variables. So temperature, relative humidity, wind speed, precipitation, and the day of year. And these are my site variables I use for occupancy. I use canopy cover, sapling density, distance from water, average basal area, and the trem variables. So it's important to have hypotheses before you run the models, and then only run the models that you have a hypothesis for. So these were my hypothesized relationships between the detection and occupancy and each variable. And these hypotheses were made based on previous studies and a literature review. So I hypothesized for the detection that temperature and day of year would have a positive relationship with probability of detection. So the warmer it is, the higher the probability of detection. And I hypothesized that humidity, wind speed, and precipitation would have a negative relationship with probability of detection. For the occupancy models, I hypothesized that all of the variables would have a negative relationship with probability of occupancy. I didn't end up including the trem variables in this analysis because it wouldn't be informative, but I will be including the trem variables once I analyze all of my data from 2021 and 2022. So going into my results, starting with the vegetation data, I ran t-tests to compare the cut and control sections of electric fence. There were significant differences between the means of the average basal area, the average canopy cover, and the average number of saplings between the cut and control sites. So the structure of the forest was significantly changed. For the people who can think in terms of basal area, the control sections had an average of 33.5 meters squared per hectare, and the cut sections had an average of 17.9 meters squared per hectare. So here are some preliminary results of Myotis bat activity. We got over 5,000 Myotis call files in the summer of 2021 in electric fence. And these are not the occupancy modeling results. These are just t-test results comparing the mean number of Myotis calls in the cut and the control sections. And just from this t-test data, there was not a significant difference. However, this doesn't really tell us much since the number of calls doesn't consider imperfect detection. And also one call doesn't equal one bat. So for example, one of these sites here, we got almost 3,000 calls, but that could be 30 bats flying past the detector 100 times. We really don't know. So occupancy modeling is much more informative. So going into those detection and occupancy models, This chart shows the most informative detection models and their effect on probability of detection. I did run models with the other detection variables, but the model with both temperature and precipitation data was the most informative and had the highest model weight. So this showed that temperature and precipitation have a negative effect on detection. So the more rain there was, the lower the probability of detecting bats, and the warmer it was, the lower the probability of detecting bats. And the individual temperature and precipitation models had the same result. This chart shows the most informative occupancy models and the effect on the probability of occupancy. So average canopy cover was the most informative model, followed by average sapling density. So this model shows that there's a lower probability of occupancy of bats, the higher the canopy cover, and the lower the probability of occupancy, the higher the sapling density. So looking a little bit more into my detection models, the temperature detection model was different than I hypothesized. We expected temperature to have a positive effect on detection, but there really wasn't a large enough temperature range to see a strong negative trend. The minimum temperature was 44.7 degrees Fahrenheit and the maximum temperature was 70.8. And it is expected that bats would be flying between those two temperatures. The precipitation model was consistent with our hypotheses as we expected less bats to be flying when there was more rain. And Gallagher et al. Also found this in Huntington Forest. It's worth noting that July 2021 was exceptionally rainy. Going into our occupancy models, our top weighted occupancy models were consistent with what we had hypothesized. We hypothesized that there would be an increased probability of occupancy at the sites with lower canopy cover, and that's what our models also showed. Just to show you what canopy cover actually was in the sites, I analyzed canopy cover in percentage classes. So in the cut sections, there was an average canopy cover of 11 to 25%, and in the control sections, there was an average canopy cover of 76 to 90%. For the sapling density, we also found the same relationship. There was a higher probability of occupancy in areas with lower sapling density. So in the cut sections, there was an average of 1,520 saplings per hectare, and in the control sections, there was an average of 3,657 saplings per hectare. And the canopy cover models agree with what Gallagher et al. Found in Huntington Forest. And from these models, these preliminary models, we can make the preliminary conclusion that the managed sites in electric fence created habitat for Myotis bats by removing the beach clutter. And this is consistent with results from other studies. For example, Duvall et al. Found that Myotis bats, particularly Indiana bats and northern long-eared bats in Indiana, foraged in patch cuts, historic forest openings, and forest thinnings, in which they included a recent shelterwood harvest, which is what electric fence is. So as I mentioned, I do have that third question I'm going to be answering once I incorporate all of my data. So I will be incorporating the 2022 acoustic data into my cut versus control study in electric fence. And I'm also going to be incorporating acoustic data from another managed site. So this site was a more traditionally managed shelterwood that did not retain large diameter trees or purposely maintain trees with tree-related microhabitats like cavities or peeling bark. So I will be comparing the acoustic and vegetation data at these sites, and that will allow us to compare the number of trems at the sites and if the retention had a positive effect on bat occupancy. Also, my research is not the only one going on at the Huntington Forest electric fence site. My lab mates are also working there. So Monica is looking at songbird occupancy in managed forests in the Adirondacks, including at the electric fence site. And Laurel is looking at insect biodiversity and tree canopies in a cut versus control site in electric fence. And that insect data might give us some further insight onto why bats are using electric fence the way they are. I want to thank Monica, Laurel, Alexa, and Hannah for help with project development and data collection. And also thank you to all of my funding sources. And of course, thank you to my committee for helping me put together this presentation. These are all of my sources. And are there any questions?
Julia, great job. I know you and Vanessa will be coordinating the questions, but I just want to jump in and say that I think that was a really well done presentation, very interesting. And as host, I get the first question. So the conclusion was the bats, you had higher bat occupancy in areas that had been managed.
Mhm.
And I'd like you to speculate whether you think that's because they can more effectively access those areas in the absence of a beach understory, or is it because there's more insects in those areas and so they're drawn to those areas? Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
we're not really sure about that. Once my lab mate gets more data on her insects, we might be able to tell that. Yeah.
So go out on a limb. What do you think it is? What's your prediction?
I think it's probably because it's more open, just because in the previous studies, the Myodis bats do prefer to forage in the more open areas. So that's likely why they're using this shelter wood.
So you would think that there would be similar abundances of insects in managed and unmanaged areas.
Yeah, potentially.
Okay. Okay, I'll turn it over to, thank you. I'll turn it over to you and Vanessa. And there's several questions and comments coming in.
Okay, yeah, thank you everyone, and great job, Julia. I guess, Julia, if you want to just go back one slide to your reference slide, and I can send some links to some of those references as well, like the Dival paper and the Gallagher paper. So I have those up, and I'll pop those in the link. But if you want to leave that up, someone asked to see that, and we can send some links to those as well. All right, I'll go back to the will be posted on your YouTube link on there, and it should be up by Thursday. And Christy asked about some of the acoustic equipment. So I did link the wildlife acoustics one if you're interested in the one that attaches to your phone. It's like a microphone that attaches to your phone. So I linked that. If people are interested in the other acoustic equipment, let us know in the chat, and I can add a couple other links in there as well. Okay. Let's see. Dana asked, how large of an area should the 60% canopy cover be maintained around the roost tree? Julie, if you go back to those screenshots, and I'll copy and paste this in the chat, the screenshots from the Indiana Bat Fish and Wildlife Service guidelines, I think it does have it by stand, and it's kind of based on what the stand, it's like a stand by stand basis.
Yeah.
So not all the states have very good outlines of it, but we picked Indiana and Vermont because they do a good job, like with their their local Fish and Wildlife Service, of putting that up. So I'll put that in the link on, and if you wanted to add anything else, Julia, go for it. And I'll put the so this is for Indiana bat and northern long-eared bats, and this is the state, but it is based on federal things too. But like she mentioned, the some of these trees you may not have in the area that you're in, so we can post some of the local things here. Okay, yeah, thank you, Stacey. You put up one of them too. So this, the one that she's sharing directly in there is the one. It was like a more recent one we could find from Indiana, and then ones like we saw for like Vermont and other places were all pretty similar. All right, let me scroll back up to the other questions here. Everyone's saying great presentation. Okay. Lauren asked, great work and presentation. Could the increased bat activity in thinned plots be a short-term trend? I've seen a study that mentioned that there's a decline in activity after 5 years. Do you want to expand on what your thoughts might be, Julia?
Sure. I mean, it could definitely be a short-term trend. These cuts just happened in electric fence over the winter of 2020 and 2021. So these are very like right after the cut happened. This is what the bats are doing. But yeah, it would definitely be interesting to see what the bats are doing more long-term. And of course, the beach are gonna start growing back. They're already starting to grow back. So as that clutter fills in, the bats might stop using that area.
All right.
Right. I can
yeah.
chime in on that. This is Stacy. Hi, everybody. In this region of the Adirondacks, it's very typical to have that forest canopy come back in within 8 to 10 years. So yeah, this might be a sort of a temporary fix on a stand basis. So I think it's important for us to be looking at bat use of habitats on a landscape basis.
Yeah, thank you, Stacy. Yeah, there are definitely a couple of studies that have done landscape. A lot of my stuff in the past has been more landscape. I'm going to link in the chat Tim Dival, one of the papers we cited about the regeneration, and he looked at foraging telemetry with Indiana bats and northern long-eared bats in Indiana, and this is at a forest study site that has like kind of more long-term research too. So I'll link that in there for those interested more on that paper. Okay, let's see. Let's scroll back up here. Okay, I think some of these other ones we got, so I'm going to jump. Okay, so John asked, yes, would be interesting to know what composition of habitats support what kind and what abundance of insects, and what do the bats being studied prefer? Julia, do you want to weigh on that one, or I can jump in as well?
You probably have more knowledge on what the bats are doing insect-wise.
Yeah, so we're excited about the work that the other master student is doing with doing the insect collection. Stacy, has there been any insect collection done at Newcomb before?
Not in the canopy. Most of
Okay.
that work's been done on the ground, and it's probably not terribly relevant to bat communities.
Okay. I will share actually the same author that I just linked in there, Tim Dival. I'm name dropping him only because we worked on our PhDs together, so I'm really familiar with his research. But he also did a lot of more molecular stuff, and actually, as a part of this study he did with Indiana northern long-eared bats, did look at what the insect diets were of these. So it'll take me a minute to pull that up, but I'll pull that up before we leave here and put it in the chat as well. So that will give an idea, but again, that's Indiana. We don't totally know up here, but I think with genetic research, we're getting a better idea of what is going on with that too. Okay, Elise asks, hi Julia, excellent work. Curious if you took into account consistency in deployment areas and mic heights. I'm assuming they were wildlife acoustics, omnidirectional mics. Can you explain your setup, Julia?
Yeah, so I didn't use wildlife acoustic mics. I used Pedersen D500X detectors and the microphones that come with those. I had them on top of 2-meter poles. So let me see if I have a picture right here somewhere. Where are they? There's one. So I don't know if the mouse is showing up, but that was my detector setup. The microphone was on top of a 2-meter pole. All of them were 2 meters. And I did have them in the same spots. This map shows the spots. I kept them in there in those same spots from 2021 to 2022 as well.
All right. If you want more info, just go ahead and put that in the chat and I'll add that in there. And I did find the prey paper. Stacy, while I put that in there, if you see a question you want to read out loud to Julia, go for it. And then,
Sure. So some of these are, I think, not necessarily questions that we're prepared to answer at this point in the research, but Sean asked about a list of tree species that are preferred for roosting and what ages or sizes are preferred. So that's a hard one to answer, and maybe Vanessa can answer that one a little bit. I think the literature is not yet clear on that, other than that, you know, there's sort of a minimum size for most bats that are going to need, you know, a tree is usually not going to have that kind of flaky bark until it gets to a certain size. So it really has to do with that physical structure. But Julia or Vanessa, if you want to add to that, go ahead.
Yeah, Julia, you go first and I'll add on some additional info.
Okay, yeah, so like I said, with this paper and there's not really a lot of roost papers in New York, but we do have those lists of tree species that I put up. This study found that roost trees were on average 45 centimeters diameter and 18.9 meters tall. If you look through the literature and look at different roost tree papers where they looked at roosting habits of bats, they do usually say all the roost characteristics, so the average diameter and if they were snags or not, things like that. So it's just going to be specific to the area that you're interested in.
Yeah, so I'll share this meta-analysis that came out in 2009 on some of the Myodis roost. So it's a good one that kind of cites a few different papers. And I know a more recent one came out last year. I just haven't found it yet. I should have pulled up the tab for that. I will say for my work of doing stuff in the Southeast, around Tennessee, North Carolina, some of that work has been published. You can look for that, but we had even like northern long-eared bats using very tiny snags that we were nervous we were going to knock over. So there is quite a variety in there, but we try to get some of these meta-analysis are helpful, and then looking at the regional differences. So some areas I worked in, just shagbark hickory wasn't really a thing, and that was developed around the Midwest where they saw Indiana bats using that. And we saw, them using pines and quite a different roost tree selection in different regions. So more and more work's coming out, and we're hopefully I would like to eventually do some roost stuff in New York in the Adirondacks, but we aren't quite there yet. And thank you, Stacy, for sharing the paper that we have done with the acoustics around here. Okay, let's see. Next questions. Okay, so Elise brought up a good point, and you can expand on this a little, Julia. That they're always thinking about how vegetation presence can impact recording efficacy, and thus might bias results. So if you want to explain kind of how you set those up to try to get in there in those more cluttered areas. I think you answered some of it, but
I'm not sure. I think I have a picture. I don't know if I should try to find that, but in the uncut sections where I put my detector, I put them kind of in forest clearings, so they weren't like straight in a bunch of beech clutter. They were in a small opening. But also the occupancy modeling, the way you do the modeling and you look at the detection and the occupancy variables, that does help to reduce the bias between the cut and the control sections by taking that vegetation into account.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Okay, Todd asked, and this is a good question here. And I'll preface this with saying that Julia's analysis is preliminary and just based off of her first year of acoustic data. So Todd says canopy cover was substantially lower, 11 to 25% versus the 60% recommended in guidelines, correct? And yet still significantly beneficial over closed canopy control areas. We've seen comparatively high numbers in long-term forest management areas here where acoustical monitoring is done. Thoughts, particularly since logging commonly cited as detrimental to populations. If you want to show one of your results there, the discussion where you have the range of the canopy stuff. So go ahead, Julia, and I can expand if needed. Or do you want me to go? I know it's hard.
Yeah, you can say if you have an answer.
Yeah, so Todd, I think that's like a super important question that you ask. And I think what Stacy mentions too, where it does start to like fill in later with that canopy cover, it is lower than that recommended 60%. We'll kind of see what we get with this like next year of data with that she's just recorded, but we haven't analyzed all of it yet, and see if that like kind of impacts it with a larger sample size, but it was lower, but the sapling density is playing a role there as well too. So in the Gallagher paper too that we cited, we were seeing that lower canopy cover, and that was more across a wider area, not just in this smaller research site. So I think looking at those percentages, it does expand it a little bit more with the canopy cover. But yeah, I think trying to find that balance in leaving up roost trees. The lower canopy cover is going to increase sunlight exposure on those roost trees and on those snags. And so that, looking at roosting and what they're doing in the day, that could be the benefit of having that lower canopy cover. But you also need to have the trees there for those roosts. It's a kind of delicate balance that we're still continuing to figure out.
Yeah, I can add to that just a tiny bit. I think it's really important to recognize context. This is a heavily forested area, 85% or more canopy cover in average in the mature forests. This would be a pretty different study if we were working in an agricultural matrix where you had a lot of open lands with some forest woodland patches. So I think we really need to put that into perspective. There's a lot of forest around the areas that were cut. So just, again, kind of remembering where the bats are going and what kinds of microhabitats they may be using. That's really what we're focusing on.
Yeah, good point. Thank you, Stacey. I think that pulls into the question from Craig as well. It said you found a negative relationship between canopy cover and bat occupancy. Is there a threshold where the canopy cover can be too low to benefit bats? So I think we kind of grouped that in the bats need trees and some canopy cover, correct? Otherwise, we would select prairies over woodlands. Yeah, I think what Stacey just added there and what we were just saying is trying to find that balance. We have a question about how effective are bat houses in encouraging bats. Julia, do you want to answer that one, or I can?
I think you have more experience with bat houses.
Okay. There's a lot of great research coming out about bat houses and bat boxes. I have a couple of them pulled up because we figured some people would ask about this. I think, it's better to have their natural habitat, but sometimes if you want to have the bat boxes, you want to provide some habitat, it can be good. And the type of bat house can matter, and the temperature in the bat box can matter. So there's some new research that's come out in the past couple of years that's really highlighted the style of the bat box and looking at the temperature analyses there. There are a couple of bat boxes out at Huntington Wildlife or at the forest there. We did see little brown bats using them, and they were ones that they set up to try to get the bats to use the human dwelling areas less. And so the little brown bats are using those. But trying to leave up the snags in their natural habitat, I think, can be more important. I'll throw in some of the links to those bat box studies. Dina asked, is there protective measures afforded bat hibernation sites in forest management regime? Julia, do you want me to answer that one? Or?
I can take it a little bit.
Go ahead.
So the bats they hibernate in caves. They don't hibernate in the forest. So they do migrate from the forest to the caves to hibernate. So those caves are usually known, the state knows where they are because of the protected species and all that. So there's likely a protected area of forest around those caves.
Yeah, so I'm forgetting the number off the top of my head, but there is a buffer around those caves where you can't do harvest around those. I think it's actually in one of the links that I sent out that mentions the cave protection. New York, I'll throw this one up here. It's kind of like a self-evaluation for northern long-eared bats. And I don't know if this one has the cave measurements in here. So I have a lot of tabs open, but that one is from the DEC and mentions a little bit about, oh yeah, here it is. 0.25 miles of a hibernation site or 150 feet of a known roost tree on there. All right. If any, Peter or Stacy or Julia, if you see a question I missed, go ahead and tackle that. And I think we got everyone.
Yeah, I
But
think got all the questions that I saw.
I concur. I haven't seen any unanswered questions.
okay, and I will throw up some, and I see Stacy putting some stuff in the chat too, some of the bat box design. So this one looks at different bat box designs here. And it just came out last year. So that can hopefully be helpful. And some general, like Bat Conservation International has some general information on like where to put up a bat box or a bat house. So, and they're a good resource too if you ever have a bat in your house or gardening for bats. They have a lot of different good information on there.
So I will just, so you know, I don't know how well the chat shows up on YouTube. So what I'll do is in the YouTube description, I'll put a link to my blog site, and I've saved the chat, and I will retain that as a document posted into that blog site. So people will be able, if they go see the YouTube site, they'll be able to follow a link from that description to the blog. And similarly in the blog, I'll connect them to the YouTube site. So we'll get this kind of back and forth going. Because these are a bunch of great references that I want people to have continued access to.
Great, thank you.
So any other questions for the presenters? And Julia and Vanessa and Stacy have done an awesome job preparing for and responding to the questions. Okay, seeing none, I want to thank Julia and Vanessa and Stacy and Greg for the work that they've done. And I look forward to having you back at 7 o'clock tonight. And I want to thank the audience for participating. Hope you all have a wonderful fall. We'll see you at a future webinar. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
My pleasure.